Hi, so for my presentation, I'll be doing Module 14, the Civil War, and I'll be doing Chapter 4, the Union Triumphing. So the first learning objective in that chapter was to describe reasons why many Americans doubted that Lincoln would be reelected. So the first reason I found was that many people thought of Lincoln as a dictator rather than a president. And obviously this is going to be a problem because no one favors a dictator. And the reasons behind this was that he was uncaringly drafting people into combat. Basically, all these mothers were losing their sons, all these wives were losing their husbands. There's obviously nothing you can do about it. You get to fight for the country, and Lincoln wanted to win, so he was drafting more troops. But from the standpoint of a civilian, it can look dictatorial. The second point I found was that many Northerners saw Lincoln's campaign pictures as very suspect, very untrustworthy. And obviously, when you're campaigning, you want the best picture of yourself. You want your best self to be put out there because you're going to be running this country. You're going to be running this new successful, like the new big thing, America. So you have to put your best foot forward, and he did not. The next thing was a group called the Radicals. They were a small group of Republicans that were very spoken on the fact that Lincoln was timid and indecisive and didn't know what he wanted for America. Obviously, he did know what he wanted for America, but he was not very spoken on it just because of all the controversy happening in versus the Union versus the Confederate at the time. So because of all these mixed emotions about Lincoln, no one really knew how the election was going to turn out. But towards the end of 1864, when the war was coming to a close, there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of buzz of this war being completely won by the Union. There were all these battles being won by the Union, and so everyone was very excited, and therefore Lincoln was gaining popularity. The election was won by Abraham Lincoln in 1864 against General George McClellan. Lincoln won all but 3 states, Delaware, Kentucky, and New Jersey. The next learning objective in the chapter was to explain how the Confederate forces were being so overpowered by the Union forces. So, obviously, we're going to talk about General Sherman. General Sherman was a very big part of the end of the war, a very big part of the Union taking over the Confederacy, completely destroying it. We found that General Sherman his biggest goal was to take over Atlanta, and he did that. September 1st was a big part of the Union War. So what happened on September 1st was the ammunition was blown up by the Confederates. This was a sign that General Sherman knew that the Confederate troops were evacuating Atlanta and they were completely giving up. The mayor of Atlanta finally told him, you know what, we're going to give up. You can take our city, but let us live here still, you know? When Atlanta was won, about a week later, General Sherman calls for Field Order 67, which is expelling of civilians in the city. The mayor says that he can't do that, and Sherman says, war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. So because Sherman knew the lay of the land, he knew that he was going to win this, and he knew going into this with all of his passion, with all of his effort, that this was going to be a war won by him and his Union. So there was roughly 3,000 Atlantans that were forced to leave. So if you got a job working for the Union, you luckily got to stay in Atlanta. The slaves celebrated it very excitedly. They were happy that they were finally free from these Confederates. Obviously, as we know, they were still so segregated, but they were not as used for slavery, not as abused, just more liberated. Obviously not as much, but still better than working on these plantations for hours and hours on end for pennies a day. It was called Sherman's March to the Sea. He was seeking to fully demoralize the South, seeking to fully take away all of their rights, what they had worked for, what the Confederacy was. Houses and barns were burned along the way, homes were looted, food was stolen, crops were destroyed, orchards and Agricultural fields were burned and livestock was killed or confiscated. In short terms, Sherman brought complete destruction and made Georgia howl. And that is how we, the Union, the now United States of America, had ended up winning the war under rule of Abraham Lincoln. Thank you.